Tuesday, it's election day. And there is no shortage of people who will tell you who to vote for. No shortage. There's even going to be some places where someone's going to stand up in front of a building like this, in front of a crowd, and tell them who to vote for. Okay? Now, if that's what you came here before, I got to disappoint you. Okay? Because I'm not going to be telling you who to vote for. And there's a number of reasons. One is I don't necessarily think that a congregation should do automatically whatever a pastor says. You know, because that's usually the mark not of a pastor, but of a cult leader. And that's not where we're going for. Okay? Another reason is it's illegal. Okay? The Johnson Amendment prohibits pastors from endorsing a candidate in their official capacity. Now, that doesn't stop everybody, but it is illegal. So, I am not going to tell you who to vote for. But a monk from the 15th century is going to tell you how to vote. Okay. Now, notice I said this monk from the 15th century is going to tell you how to vote, not who to vote for. Because obviously, a monk from the 15th century doesn't even know who's running in 2024. We're going to take a look at the namesake of this denomination, the namesake of the church that we are a part of, to give us some wisdom on how to vote. We're going to look back to Martin Luther for some wisdom. Luther was a very important person, not only in the church, but in history itself. And Martin had some beautiful, amazing, great ideas that have shaped not only the Lutheran church, but have shaped all of Christianity. Now, in addition to these great ideas, Martin Luther also had ideas that proved to be not so good. In our modern, they may have seemed reasonable at the time, but in our modern world, they haven't stood the test of time. And Martin also had some horrible ideas that his followers have since repudiated. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the ideas that didn't stand up so well to the test of time. We're going to talk about the horrible ideas, and then we're going to get back to the good idea that maybe we can apply as we vote. So, if a person hears, oh, Martin Luther is going to tell us how to vote, maybe it's Martin's political ideas. Now, Martin had a lot of political ideas, but Martin was a monk in the 15th century. And some of these ideas did not hold up so well. First of all, the idea of voting would be very foreign to Martin, because the idea of democracy simply wasn't around in the 1500s. Kings and princes were the rulers. Kings and princes, they governed by force or sometimes by negotiation. And the church at the time of Luther was also part of this ruling and this governing. And Luther and the corrupt leaders at the time, well, they came to conflict over various things, including theology. Now, Luther reasoned, he said, God is in charge of both the spiritual world, both the church world, and the secular world, the world that's being ruled. He came up with this idea and called it the two kingdoms idea. That God's in charge of both, but God manages them differently. Now, as modern readers, maybe we see a little seed of the idea of separation of church and state here, but I'm not positive that was what Luther was getting at. Because Luther believed that people should not necessarily be part of their own government. They should be the subject of the princes and rulers. A place where we see this idea in history pushed to its unhappy extreme is during a time called the Schmalkaldic Wars. Now, Schmalkaldic, fun word to say, but not a good thing, okay? The Schmalkaldic Wars happened when the peasants, because this was a feudal system, decided, hey, we're being oppressed and we'd like some more rights. They were actually, kind of pushed along a little bit by some of Luther's writings and works that they heard about, that they are part of the church as well. But Luther's writings from the time, he was asked to take a position on this, and he chose the princes and the kings, and actually said, well, no, this is the divine will of God. You princes and kings, you need to put down this peasant revolt and kill them if necessary. Now, now he repented a little bit later and said, whoa, maybe you guys went a little too far in this, and asked for some more grace on the parts of the kings. But, this political idea does not really hold up so well now. So many died. A charitable look at the writings of Luther would say, well, Luther was just a person of his time. And maybe that's the case. Or maybe we need to be objective and say, well, in this example, Luther had a little bit of a moral failing. Great leaders in history are still humans and still make mistakes and still do things that history is going to say was a bad idea. Now, Luther's opposition to the peasants, not his worst idea. Not his worst idea. There was one even worse. And this happened toward the end of his life. You see, Luther had refined his ideas about salvation and grace, and we're going to come back to these ideas about salvation and grace in just a moment. Now, in Luther's time, there were very few atheists, or at least people who would say they were atheists. It just wasn't done. There were Christians, Jews, and Muslims that Luther could encounter. And after extensive work on theology in the Christian church, Luther moved some of his focus to showing the way of salvation to the Jewish people. We would probably call this in modern times an effort to convert the Jewish people. And Luther became frustrated as he tried to convince the people of what he thought was an obvious thing to do. They did not respond, at least not all of them. So Luther started to write some things because the Jews did not convert, and he was not very pleasant, to say the least. Luther wrote some very anti-Semitic things at the end of his life, things that at this point the Lutheran Church has denounced. Now, a few things about the idea of anti-Semitism before we go on. Anti-Semitism, one of the ways to define it is discriminating against the Jewish people or considering them inferior or other because they're Jewish. It's similar to racism, where people are considered inferior or discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity. Now, anti-Semitism is not the same as being critical of the nation of Israel. Just as many Americans are critical of our government's actions, many Israelis are critical of their government's actions. Just like Americans are allowed to be critical of the actions of France, Americans are allowed to be critical of the actions of Israel and not being anti-Semitic. Because it's entirely possible to be horrified and to condemn the actions of Hamas on October 6, 2023, and also be horrified and condemn the loss of innocent people in Gaza. The two are not mutually exclusive. Now, that being said, anti-Semitism is real. It is happening in the world. And it is something that, especially as Christians, we need to condemn. And we need to be careful. Like there's places in the Bible where, like in the book of John, it says, and the Jews. And the Jews is not used in a positive light. We need to remember that the author of John, the author of Mark, Jesus is calling out the specific leaders that are leading the people astray, not the Jewish people. Back to Luther. Now, some have tried to soften Luther's anti-Semitic views by saying, well, his writings were anti-Semitic, yes, but they were against the faith of the Jewish people, not the identity of the Jewish people. Okay? They were still anti-Semitic. And the Nazis certainly did not see the difference. The Nazis took the work of Luther in this area and caused quite a few problems, to say the least. Now, there were those who spoke up and acted and said, you have misappropriated what Luther said. And one of them was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, probably the second most famous Lutheran after Martin. He helped start what was known as the Confessing Church in opposition to what was happening in Germany. And his opposition eventually cost him his life in a Nazi concentration camp. Now, earlier, I promised that Martin Luther, this 15th century monk, would give us some wisdom on how to vote. But it seems like all I've done so far is tell you some bad things. Probably depressed you a little bit. Okay? But here is the promise. Because we're going to push aside Martin Luther's political philosophy. We're going to say that he was a person that made some mistakes, but now we're going to focus on the beautiful thing. We're going to focus on the power of God and grace that has come through. We're going to have some good news now. You see, in young Martin Luther, there was a nervous and anxious young man. A man who was striving so hard to do what he thought God wanted him to do. A man that was very worried about his own salvation. Would he be good enough to get into heaven? What works would he have to do to be able to be right with God? Now, Martin was so nervous and anxious about this that as he was learning to become a monk, he actually annoyed his superiors because he went to confession a lot, because he wanted to make sure that all his sins were known and that he was forgiven them. He would leave the confessional and then come back a little bit later and say, oh, I forgot this one. Legend is that his superior said, hey, Martin, come back when you've committed a real sin. Now, eventually, Martin studied, searched his heart, searched the Bible, and found out, oh my goodness, this salvation is not up to me. This salvation is a gift from God. This salvation is the grace and love of Jesus Christ that's given to us, and all we have to do is accept it. What do we need to do? We need to trust that God has done all the things for us, that God has it all figured out, and we don't have to do it. We just need to accept it. Martin Luther found this in the Bible and reiterated what was known and gave it to the people to say, don't continue to work. Just accept the love of Jesus Christ and live. So, Martin then reasoned this, said, now that as followers of Jesus Christ, as those that trust in the love and grace of God, we know that God has it figured out for us. And we know that we don't have to do work to make our salvation real. It's real already. What are we to do? What is our job to do as followers of Christ? And Martin said, well, since you're all taken care of, now you got to start working for your neighbor. You've got to start thinking about the others in your life because you have been taken care of. So as a follower of Christ, as a Christian, you are to think about the other. You are to think about the neighbor. And we know from Jesus that Jesus has got a pretty expansive view of who the neighbor is. You know, think back to the story of the Good Samaritan. Who's the neighbor? Jesus doesn't exclude anyone from being a neighbor. The neighbor is who we are to focus on. Now, brings us to voting. So Martin Luther would say that we are to be concerned with our neighbor. So who should we vote for? We should vote for the interest of our neighbor. That is what Martin Luther would tell us to do when we go to the voting booth. It's to think not only of ourselves, but to think of those who are in need, those who are in need of the grace and love of God, and those who are in need, period. Martin Luther is asking us to vote for our neighbor, for the fellow child of God who may not be the same as us, but is still loved by God and cherished. Amen.